So John Lennon once wrote, "Life is what happens while you're busy making plans." You've heard that before, right? Well, that was certainly true for me this week. You see, I had this inspiration for several weeks now that I wanted to do a talk on muscle memory. But we were in the middle of a 7-week series based on a book, so I needed to wait until we were done with the series, which we were last week. And I was super excited about this topic. I had notes all over my desk, I had quotes all ready to go, I had this fun personal experience to illustrate the point. All I had to do was sit down yesterday and write it. And then the insanity in the form of mass murders in Paris and Beirut. And all of a sudden, my fun and funny talk about muscle memory didn't seem quite so important. So what I am attempting to do today is to bring the two together, talk about muscle memory, and also make it relevant for what is happening in our world right now. And I think I did it because the premise, the thing that is the most important for us to remember at this time is that God is all there is. Now, yeah, you're like, well, yeah, you say that every week, but I'm really going to illustrate it right now. Because in the face of inexplicable violence and senseless killings, there in the midst of all of it is Spirit, is God. And we may not be able to see it right now. Whew, it's really, really hard because we're dealing with emotions and we're dealing with the horror of the past couple of days. But if I know anything, I know that God is all there is. And I know then, therefore, that God is in the center of this, even when I'm not able to see it with my eyes or hear it with my ears. And it is this knowing, it is this conviction, it is this faith that's at the heart of my talk about muscle memory. So let me define, first of all, what muscle memory is. Muscle memory is the ability to repeat a specific muscular movement with improved efficiency and accuracy that is acquired through practice and repetition. Huh? Okay, an easier way of putting it is a type of movement with which the muscles become familiar over time. So what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see that second thing? A type of movement with which muscles become familiar over time. Riding a bicycle. Riding a bicycle. We have all been told that once we learn how to ride a bicycle, it becomes ingrained into our memory through repetition. And that any time that we get on a bike from that moment on, we remember how to do it. Now, what's so interesting about this is when I was doing my research about muscle memory, I went online, of course, which I always do, and I looked up an article about riding a bike, and it mentions muscle memory. I love it when I know what I'm talking about. It's so cool. So the first time that I ever heard of this phenomenon called muscle memory was when I first started doing yoga at age 50. Now, under any circumstances, starting a yoga practice at age 50 has its own set of challenges, right? Then you add to the fact that I have a certain amount of excess me that makes it all more daunting, right? But I was determined to try it because some of the coolest and most spiritual people I know are into yoga, right? So I figured it should have some benefits for me as well. Needless to say, my first few attempts at doing yoga were not what I would call hugely successful. I grunted, I groaned, I whined, I sighed, I yelped. And I'm sure that I looked pretty silly while I was doing it. But I kept with it Because what I like is also the spiritual aspect of yoga, tying in the breath along with the movements and everything. So I kept with it, and after some time, I noticed the strangest thing. Some of the poses that had really vexed me in the beginning were all of a sudden easier. And I could get into them without a huge amount of grunting and groaning and whining and sighing and yelping. And then not only could I get into the poses without a lot of drama, I found that I was able to do them quite naturally. It became second nature to me. It was almost, need I say, it was almost graceful. So I asked one of my beloved teachers what the deal was. Why was that happening? And what she called it, she explained to me the concept of muscle memory. She said that with enough repetition, our muscles tend to remember what to do. Now, of course, we know it's not really the muscles, but it's actually the mind that remembers by developing new neural pathways. That's a whole other talk. We'll get into it another time. But muscle memory, I think, sounds a lot cooler than neural pathways. Muscle memory, it's like, yeah, it sounds yoga-like. So another way of putting it is continued use causes new habits to become second nature to us. Yes? Is this making sense? So I love it when the universe supports me in what I think my talk is going to be about, and as it did this week. So I went to a 55-plus yoga class this week for the first time in several weeks. Now, 55 plus is a nice way of calling geezer yoga. So there were other geezers, other people in the class too. And they were absolute beginners. They were absolute beginners. Therefore, they did not have the muscle memory that comes from years of practice, right? So our teacher would lovingly guide us into a pose, like a warrior pose, right? And I would just naturally go into my warrior pose, and I know I've got it going on, right? Because I've been doing yoga forever. And I looked over at the other people in the thing, and they didn't look anything like this. Let's just put it that way. That they were in some configuration of something, but it wasn't correct. And at first I was like, what the heck? That's not even close. I know I'm mean. I know. I'm mean streak. It's okay. I'll get over it. Because what I realized was, this was an exact demonstration of muscle memory that I was going to talk about today. I hadn't practiced in several weeks. But because I have muscle memory, I remember how to do these things. These people had never done it before. Therefore, they didn't have a clue. And it was perfect. So I'm not telling you this because to set myself up as some sort of yoga expert, blah, 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 blah. I'm doing it to illustrate the importance of developing the muscle memory and the habits and the behaviors that we want to have active in our lives. So that we develop the muscle memory and the habits so that we have that muscle memory so to create the lives that we want. Is this making sense? Okay, let me say more about this. All of us, myself included, have negative muscle memory that can attract that kind of negativity into our lives. Nod your head if you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I invite you to think for a moment about your habitual thinking. Your go-to thinking. The thinking that you do when you're not being careful. For most of us, our habitual thinking is comprised of they done me wrong stories and drama and the coulda, woulda, shouldas, and negativity, right? What happens is that kind of thinking attracts more drama and more negativity into our lives, which then just strengthens the muscle memory and the negative habitual thinking, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. Unless, of course, we consciously, on purpose, with intention, train ourselves to turn away from the negative habitual thinking and embrace consciously, on purpose, embrace the positive spiritual way of seeing the world and our lives. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, put it like this: our habitual thought patterns are being reflected in all our images of thought. Also, the subconscious mind is a great creative reservoir. It is operating through each one of us. Any negativity of thought may be changed by consciously identifying ourselves with and maintaining only good, positive ideas. Such new identification thus becomes the law of our life. So we've got the negativity, we have to consciously choose, consciously identify ourselves with, and keep our minds on the things that we want to have happen, the thoughts that we want to have creating, because that then becomes the law of our life. So does that mean then that if all of us took full responsibility for our habitual thinking and our muscle memory and only had happy, positive thoughts all the time, then things like what happened in Paris this weekend would never happen? Ideally, yes. Ideally, as the consciousness of the world rises up, and I believe that that is happening, as the consciousness of the world rises up and embraces love and peace and joy and harmony and acceptance and kindness and compassion, then there will no longer be any room for things like what happened this weekend to happen. It simply won't be part of our collective consciousness, our group think, as Ron Hahn puts it, our communal vibration. When we get there, it will no longer happen. But we aren't there yet. We aren't there yet. Because we live in an inside-out world. In other words, what goes on in here affects what goes on out there, not the other way around. So until we get our own thinking in line, our outside world is going to continue to reflect the turmoil and the negativity that goes on in our minds, in our hearts, in our lives. Ernest Holmes said this: we do not control the thought of our race. We do not even seem to be able to control our own thinking. For if we did, we would be superior people. But we can at least try to control our thought. And to the degree we can, we exert some control over our environment. In such degree that we can shift the basis of our imagery, our belief, our emotional and mental reactions to life, we can come to a place individually of peace and security and happiness. And gradually, as these changes take place, there will be a corresponding change in our environment. That's really profound. That's really profound. So the question is, does it seem like a lot of work? Yeah, you know what, it does. I see some of you, yeah. So sometimes exhausting to always stand guard at the portals of our minds. Yes, it is. And if you're like me, you would really love to have everything idyllically perfect right now. You want rainbows and unicorns and baby animals and calorie-free chocolate right now. But we don't live in those times, folks. We don't. We live in these times. And we are here on purpose. We're here because we are part of the collective that is going to make a difference. We're here to help usher in a new way of being in the world. We're the ones we've been waiting for. And therefore, it is up to us to build that muscle memory and that mental equivalent of how we want the world to be. Which brings me back to what I said at the beginning of my talk about having an unshakable faith and conviction that God is all there is. I say that because the God of my understanding, a few weeks ago, if you weren't here, you should probably listen to it. We fired our old God, and we hired a God of our understanding, one that made sense to us. It was quite powerful. And the God of my understanding is based in peace and harmony and love and balance. And I can experience that love and peace and harmony and balance every day of my life if I choose. Depends on what I choose. But what I also know is that the God of my understanding works through the law of cause and effect. An impartial law that responds to our thoughts and our beliefs and our choices as individuals and as humankind. In other words, the law shows up, thereby the world shows up according to how we show up. So even in the midst of these horrific events this weekend, God was still in the midst of it, reflecting back to us our collective beliefs and our thoughts and our choices. So if we want things to be different, and we all say that we do, if we want things to be different, we need to continue to evolve away from thoughts of separation and anger and hatred and prejudice and intolerance. Because until we do, they are going to continue to show up. And with the advent of technology, stuff like this has happened for years, for millennia. But because of technology, we find out about it as it's happening. No, the news 3 or 4 months later like it used to be. It's instantaneous. So it is that instantaneous communication, that ability to reach the world like that is what's going to make the difference. So what we need to do is to continue to do our work, to develop our muscle memory of love and peace and harmony and joy and inclusivity and balance in our own lives. Because like the internet, it goes out into the world, into the consciousness instantaneously. So every time you choose a positive thought or a reaction over a negative one, you are building muscle memory for positivity. Every time you choose love over hate, just like Amy's song, you are building a consciousness of love. Every time you choose to see a bigger picture over a smaller one, you are creating a habit of open-mindedness. Every time you choose peace in the midst of violence, you are affirming the presence of God, which in turn raises the vibration of the collective consciousness of everyone, so that that becomes the way of life. So late last night, by late I mean like 8 o'clock, because I go to bed early on Saturdays. A letter was sent out to us from Dr. Ken Gordon, who is the spiritual leader of Centers for Spiritual Living, our parent organization. And I'd like to share with you some excerpts from that letter. First of all, he quotes Ernest Holmes. "Cease weeping over the mistakes of yesterday, and steadfastly holding the face of the great and divine reality, walk in that light wherein there is no darkness." And he goes on to say, with this magnificent quote, Dr. Ernest Holmes calls us to rise above our past and to envision a future that is filled with infinite possibility. As we mourn the dead once again, this time in Paris, we are pitched into sadness and even a sense of defeat. Humanity is at war with one another, and we are hard-pressed to see a way out. Yet we are being called to do just that. We begin by honoring those who perished or were wounded in these attacks, and their families, the first responders, and all others affected by these horrific acts. Let me call on everyone in our great organization to be truly of one mind in seeing the possibility of peace on our planet. Let me call upon our ministers and practitioners to reach out to members of other faith traditions and to become spokespersons for peace, justice, and harmony. Let me call upon clergy of all faith traditions to speak out for peace, not to silence the oppressed, but to give them hope. Let me call upon all those who comprise our news media to be attuned to the many efforts to seek harmony in this world and not just show carnage. Can I get an amen to that one? Let me call upon political leaders of all stripes to stop the discourse of partisanship and disharmony and to lead forcefully and directly toward a more peaceful planet. Let me call upon those who take up arms against innocence in the name of their cause or deity to see a better way forward and to be open to overtures of peace coming from within and beyond your own culture or faith tradition. Let us be willing to take the first step toward peaceful resolution. Let us do what is best.